Lady Elodie Valois was 23 years old, and in the eyes of her family, she was already dying. There was a curse in the Valois bloodline, a cruel biological clock that stopped ticking the moment a woman turned 24. If she did not bear a child by then, she never would. That was why her father had panicked. That was why he had sold her across the channel to the Duke of Aylesford, a stranger she was terrified to meet, but desperate to please. Her father called it the perfect match, as if marriages were poems and not contracts. As if the world hadn't heard him speak too fondly, too often of the Duchess of Aylesford. His first great love, still his friend. Elodie had grown up watching her mother's mouth tighten whenever that name was mentioned. Now her father spoke of ties and fate, and how things were always meant to join. It sounded ridiculous, and yet ridiculous things were the ones that became law. She had 3 months left in Paris before the wedding. 3 months to pretend she wasn't a ticking clock wrapped in silk. 3 months to become the sort of bride a duke would accept without question. Elodie stood on the corner of the Rue de Rivoli, tightening her grip on her little sister's hand. The air smelled of rain and exhaust. "Stay close, Sophie," Elodie said, her voice sharp with the underlying fear she carried everywhere. "The carriages do not stop for anyone." "But look," Sophie pointed, her small finger aiming at a rolling cart of sugar plums across the slick stones. "Elodie, look." Before Elodie could answer, the small hand slipped from hers. "Sophie." The child darted into the street. A black carriage driven too fast by a careless driver thundered around the bend. "Sophie, no!" Elodie screamed, launching herself forward. She wasn't fast enough. The horses were feet away. She saw the flash of hooves, the inevitable impact. Suddenly, a blur of dark wool moved from the other side of the street. A man, tall, broad-shouldered, lunged into the mud. He didn't hesitate. He scooped the child up in one fluid motion, turning his back to the horses, just as the carriage wheels splashed water over his boots. The street went silent. Elodie's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She ran to them, her breath catching in her throat. The stranger was already standing, setting Sophie down gently on the curb. He was drenched, his coat ruined, but his hands were steady. He looked up. Elodie stopped dead. He had eyes the color of a winter sky, clear, striking light blue, framed by dark auburn hair that clung to his forehead. He was sharp-featured, clean-shaven, and utterly devastating. He didn't look like a savior. He looked like a storm. "Is she yours?" he asked. His voice was deep, English, and rough with adrenaline. "My sister," Elodie breathed, dropping to her knees to check Sophie, checking for broken bones, for blood. "She is my sister. You saved her." "She is fast," the man said, wiping mud from his sleeve. He looked at Elodie, really looked at her, and his expression shifted. The irritation vanished, replaced by a quiet, intense curiosity. "You should hold her tighter. The world is dangerous for fragile things." Elodie stood up. Her dress was muddy, her hair was loose. She knew she looked a fright, but this man was looking at her as if she were the only woman in Paris. She felt a pull in her chest, terrifying and magnetic. She knew she should walk away. She was betrothed. She belonged to a wedding waiting in England and a deadline her body would not forgive. "I am grateful, sir," she said softly. "I do not know how to thank you." "You can tell me your name," he said. The request was simple, but it felt like a dare. She hesitated. Elodie Valois was a name that lived in letters, contracts, and her father's grip. "Rose," she lied, because her real name could be used to find her. The man smiled, and it changed his entire face. It was a dangerous smile. He stepped closer. "Well met, Rose," he said, offering a hand that was warm and strong. "I am James." He was lying too. In Paris, the Duke of Aylesford didn't move under his title. Not while he was still on tour. Not while obligations and introductions lagged behind him like paperwork. And the woman he'd been promised was standing right in front of him, drenched in rain and fury, calling herself Rose as if a different name could buy her 10 seconds of freedom. Neither of them knew. Not yet. That single lie was supposed to be a shield. When Elodie called herself Rose, she told herself it was nothing. One small theft of freedom in a life made of contracts, airs, and a curse no one spoke about without lowering their voice. But lies had a way of growing legs. And then, most inconveniently, using those legs to find you again. Because James was not simply a rich Englishman passing through Paris with too much confidence and a coat too clean for the weather. He was the Duke of Aylesford, her betrothed, her future. She had feared him like one fears a locked door, because once opened, there is no going back. And he apparently had been too busy being a duke to meet the girl he was to marry. It was almost laughable how fate solved such problems, by introducing them as strangers. 2 days later, Elodie found herself in a dusty bookshop in the Latin Quarter, fingers sliding along the spines until they stopped on a cookery book she had no business buying. The townhouse had been full of England and wedding plans and people discussing her future as if she were a chair that might be moved without complaint. And here, among paper and ink, no one expected her to be agreeable. She opened the book anyway. A soufflé, it promised, was simple. Elodie had learned that anything described as simple was usually a lie. She was still frowning at the instructions when a voice spoke from behind her, so near it might have been an extension of her own thoughts. "You look far too serious for a woman holding a recipe for soufflé." It was deep, English, and far too close. Elodie froze. She did not need to turn to know it. That voice had followed her for 2 nights. Steady, maddeningly calm, and entirely too present in her thoughts for someone she had spoken to for less than a minute. She turned slowly, as if abrupt movement might make him disappear. He did not. James was leaning against a stack of leather-bound histories like an insult to effort itself. He was dry today, dressed in a dark grey coat that looked expensive without looking theatrical, and he wore it with the careless ease of a man who had never once worried about whether he belonged somewhere. He held a book in his hand. He was not reading it. He was watching her. "And you," Elodie said, tightening her grip on the cookery book as if it might double as a shield, "look far too idle for a man who claims to be passing through." His mouth curved in a smile that suggested he found her accusation charming rather than offensive. "I'm not idle," he said. "I'm occupied." By leaning. "It is a delicate art," he replied gravely. "One must choose the proper shelf. Too low and one looks bored. Too high and one looks as though one has fainted." Elodie stared at him. He stared back as if it were the most natural thing in the world for him to find her in a bookshop and comment upon her seriousness. "You followed me," she said, because it was easier than acknowledging her heart's entirely inappropriate enthusiasm. His brows lifted. "Followed is such an ugly word." "And yet it suits," Elodie replied sweetly. "I searched," he corrected, as though that were nobler. "I dislike unfinished conversations." "We had no conversation," Elodie said. "We did," he replied. "You lied to me. I introduced myself, and then you fled into the rain as if I'd threatened you." "I did not flee." "You ran." "I walked," Elodie said tightly, with urgency. His eyes warmed, and Elodie hated that her stomach noticed. "As if the devil himself were chasing you," he murmured. "Perhaps he was," she whispered, and surprised herself with the truth. Something flickered across his expression, quick and unreadable, before the easy amusement returned. "Well," he said softly, stepping closer into the narrow aisle. "I'm not the devil." "No," Elodie thought. "You are worse. You are temptation with polite manners." "And why?" she demanded. "Are you hunting me?" His gaze fell to the book clutched against her chest. "Because," he said, "you looked at me as if you hated me." "I did not." "You did," he said, entirely unruffled. "And then you looked at me as if you didn't." Elodie's cheeks warmed. "I am perfectly consistent," she lied. "I see," he said, with a tone that suggested he saw precisely the opposite. his hand lifted toward the book. Not touching at first, hovering as if he were asking permission without the burden of actually asking. Then his fingers brushed the spine, and Elodie's breath caught like a foolish thing. "Allow me," he said. "James, no, I insist." He gently pried the book from her hands and walked to the counter with the effortless stride of a man who had never once been made to squeeze himself into a narrow aisle. Elodie watched him, thoroughly annoyed with herself for watching it all. He paid with a gold coin. Not a modest one, a bold one. The kind that made the shopkeeper's eyes widen and his posture straighten as if he had been reminded of his place in the world. James did not appear to notice, or worse, he noticed and did not care. When he returned, he placed the book back into Elodie's arms as if it belonged to her, as if she belonged to him. "Now," he said, "you may attempt a souffle and shock all of Paris." "I'm not attempting a souffle," Elodie said. "Of course not," he replied, far too agreeable. "You are merely studying it in case you are ever forced to marry one." Elodie made a sound that was not quite a laugh. He pretended not to notice. The bell above the door jingled sharply then, and a gust of cold air and street noise sliced through the quiet. A man entered, slimmer than James, umbrella in hand, his expression the particular blend of weary and irritated that suggested an aristocratic life spent being dragged from one obligation to the next. He shook water from his hat, muttered something under his breath, and then looked up. His eyes landed on James. "For God's sake," the man sighed. "There you are." James did not flinch, which was, Elodie decided, the behavior of a man accustomed to being found. "We have an appointment in an hour," the man continued. "You cannot spend the afternoon hiding in bookshops." Elodie's shoulders loosened slightly. "A friend, then. Just a friend." But then the man's gaze snapped to her, and something in it sharpened. Quick, assessing, far too knowing. "You know how the ambassador becomes when we are late," he added, voice clipped. James smiled. Charming, practiced. He gestured toward her book. "Rose, this is Sebastian. He has no appreciation for pastries." Sebastian rolled his eyes. Then he looked at Elodie properly, measuring, quick. "Mademoiselle," Sebastian said with a shallow bow. "Forgive him. Our time in France is short." The words struck Elodie like a blow. Short. Of course. A rich Englishman did not drift through Paris for love. He drifted through Paris for pleasure, for stories, for the brief thrill of being somewhere no one could demand anything of him. "We leave in a few weeks," Sebastian added, as if he were discussing weather. Elodie tightened her grip on the book until the cover bit into her palm. Of course he was leaving, and of course her own leaving would be far more permanent. "Of course," she said, her voice brittle. "Then I must go as well. My family expects me." She moved to step past James, desperate to reach the door, the street, the safety of air that did not smell like him. He did not grab her. He did not touch her. He simply shifted his stance so the narrow aisle was no longer passable. "Walk with me," James said. It was not a question. "I cannot," Elodie said at once. "Just to the corner," he replied. 10 minutes. "Surely your family can spare you 10 minutes." "My family," Elodie said tightly, "has already decided what it will spare me." James's gaze held hers, steady and unhurried. "Then take 10 minutes anyway," he said, soft enough that it felt like a secret. Elodie's throat tightened. She thought of her father's letters, the wedding date, the curse ticking quietly beneath her skin like a clock she could not stop. James leaned closer, and Elodie caught the scent of soap and faint tobacco and something sharper beneath it. Rain caught in wool. His voice dropped into something dangerously intimate. 10 minutes, Rose, he murmured. 2 strangers walking to the corner. What is the harm in that? 2 strangers. It was ridiculous. It was unbecoming. It was exactly the kind of thing sensible women did not do. Elodie had been sensible for so long she could hardly remember what it felt like not to be. She looked at his arm, offered, not forced. She looked at his eyes, the calm in them, the heat in them, the attention that had nothing to do with duty. She wanted to be Rose, just for 10 minutes. She placed her hand on his sleeve. 10 minutes, she said. James' smile was quick, satisfied but not triumphant, as if he had been waiting for her to choose him without knowing she was choosing him at all. They stepped out into the Paris sunlight. Behind them, Sebastian watched, hard, unreadable, like a man watching the first stone slide loose from a wall that had been standing for years. And Elodie told herself she was doing nothing dangerous, just walking to the corner, just 10 minutes, as if the world had ever obeyed such tidy promises. The silver spoon tapped against the porcelain of Elodie's teacup. Tink, tink, tink. In the suffocating quiet of the Valois breakfast room, it sounded louder than it should have. "You are restless this morning, Elodie," her father remarked, eyes still fixed on his newspaper. Elodie stilled her hand. "I thought I might walk to the market later, Papa. I need ribbons." The Count turned a page. The paper whispered like dry leaves. "Paris has grown unpredictable," he said mildly. "You will not go out alone." Her stomach tightened. The door opened and a man stepped inside. He was thin, grey-faced, and dressed in a suit so somber it seemed to drain colour from the room. "This is Monsieur Giroux," her father said. "He will accompany you whenever you leave the house." Giroux did not bow. He only looked at her. Elodie understood at once. This was not protection. It was supervision. "Papa." "It is decided," her father interrupted, tone smooth and immovable. "You are a future duchess. We will ensure nothing careless occurs before your departure." An hour later, Elodie moved through the crowded Rue Montorgueil, the wind tugging at the ribbons of her bonnet. The market was alive with noise, vendors shouting, wheels clattering, chestnuts roasting. Normally, she loved it. Today, she felt hunted. She did not need to turn to know Giroux was there. He followed at a precise distance, close enough to control, far enough to pretend courtesy. She slowed. He slowed. She turned. He turned. The leash was invisible, but it was tight. Elodie's heart hammered. She needed space. She needed air. She needed, against all reason, to know whether James would be there. She gestured toward a stall. "I've forgotten the color," she said, lifting her voice just enough to be heard. "I'll look closer." Before Giroux could respond, she stepped sharply to the side, disappearing into the press of bodies. She moved quickly, not running, never running, but weaving through the crowd with purpose. She turned down a narrow street, ducked beneath an awning, and pressed her back against the warm stone wall of a bakery. She waited. 1 second. 2. No grey suit. "You look," a calm voice said beside her, "like a woman who has just committed a minor crime." Elodie spun. James leaned against the bakery window, half hidden behind a display of loaves, entirely too composed. "James," she breathed. Relief washed through her so suddenly it made her light-headed. "I thought you wouldn't come." "And Miss Ribbons," he replied lightly. Unthinkable. "I shouldn't be here," she whispered. "My father hired someone. He's watching me." James's expression sharpened. Not alarmed, but alert. His gaze flicked past her shoulder, scanning reflections, movement. "Where?" "Close," she said. "Always." A shout echoed from the street, not Giroux's voice, but near enough to make her flinch. "He's coming," Elodie whispered. "This way," James said at once. "Don't argue." He didn't touch her. He simply stepped forward, guiding her back into the open doorway of a nearby print shop. The air inside was cool and dark, heavy with the smell of ink and damp paper. James positioned himself between her and the street, his presence alone enough to hide her. She was acutely aware of him, his height, his restraint, the deliberate care with which he kept his hands to himself. "Quiet," he murmured. Footsteps slowed outside. Stopped. Elodie's pulse thundered. She pressed herself against the shelves, certain it could be heard. James wasn't watching the door. He was watching her. His gaze dropped to her mouth, then lifted again, intent, unguarded. and very much aware of how close they were. Then the footsteps moved on. James exhaled slowly. "He's gone. I have to leave," Elodie whispered, though her feet refused to move. "If he circles back..." "I know. We can't keep doing this." "Then tell me to stop," James said quietly. "Tell me you don't want to see me." She met his eyes. "I can't." Something like resignation crossed his face. He stepped back at once, giving her space. "Go," he said. "I'll stay until he sees you alone." Elodie slipped back into the street and nearly collided with Giroux. His hand closed around her arm, firm and proprietary. "Mademoiselle," he said, "you were delayed." "I was choosing ribbons," she said, breathless. His gaze slid past her, toward the print shop. "We are going home," he said. "Now." That evening, rain tapped softly against the window of Elodie's bedroom. She sat at her vanity, staring at her reflection. She looked unchanged. She was not. A knock sounded. Her father stood in the doorway, impeccably dressed. "Did you find what you needed?" he asked pleasantly. "No, Papa. The market was too crowded." "A pity," he said. Then lightly, "Be careful where you walk tomorrow. Paris has many eyes." The door closed. Elodie stared at it, her blood running cold. He didn't know who. He didn't know how, but he knew enough. And she knew, terrifyingly, that she would risk everything to see James again. It began with a deception that was frankly impressive in its execution. "I cannot travel, Papa," Elodie rasped, pressing a lace handkerchief to a forehead that was cool as a cucumber. "My chest. It feels heavy." The Count de Valois looked at his daughter, then at his wife and younger daughter, who were already swathed in travel cloaks. They were bound for Lyon to visit Aunt Claire, a woman whose annual bouts of melancholia were as predictable as the tides, and twice as damp. "Very well," the Count sighed, stepping back to avoid the invisible miasma of illness. "Stay here. Recover. We shall return in 2 weeks. Giroux will watch you." But fate, it seemed, had a sense of irony. That very afternoon, Monsieur Giroux, a man whose primary joy in life was enforcing rules, collapsed with a gout so violent it could only be divine intervention. By sunset, the carriage rattled away. The heavy oak doors closed. The house fell silent. Elodie stood in the foyer. She dropped the handkerchief. She straightened her spine. She wasn't sick. She was simply unavailable for boredom. She didn't waste a second. She ran to her room and retrieved a small, crumpled note from her jewelry box. James had slipped it into her hand at the market days ago, with a sleight of hand that suggested he was either a thief or a magician, if you ever find yourself free. The ivy lane behind Rue de Varennes. The villa with the blue gate. She threw on her cloak. She didn't run. She walked with the terrifying confidence of a woman who has realized the cage door is unlocked. When she turned into the ivy-walled lane, James was already there. He wasn't waiting calmly. He was pacing the length of the cobblestones, checking his pocket watch with the neurotic frequency of a man late for his own execution. "You came," he breathed, stopping mid-step. The relief on his face was so raw, it was almost indecent. "My parents are gone," Elodie said, breathless, "for 2 weeks. I'm currently a ghost in my own city." James smiled, a slow, dangerous expression that reached his eyes. "Then let us haunt it together." "So," a sharp voice cut through the air, dry as old parchment, "this is the reason you have been trampling my ivy for 3 days." Elodie jumped. An elderly woman with silver hair and eyes that missed absolutely nothing was watching them from over the neighboring garden wall. "Madame Lefebvre," James sighed, though he didn't step away from Elodie. "I was hoping for 5 minutes of privacy. You have been pacing outside my garden like a tragic hero since Tuesday," the old woman clipped, wiping dirt from her hands on a formidable apron. She looked at Elodie, assessing her silk dress, her posture, and the expensive cut of her cloak. "I see the pacing was worth it. She is far too pretty for a man with such a sour disposition." Elodie felt a laugh bubble up. "He's only sour when he's waiting, madame. Then you had better keep him occupied. Madame Lefebvre winked, turning back to her roses with a dismissive wave. Or he will wear a hole in the street. It was the beginning of a life they had no business living. For 2 weeks, which stretched into 8 as Aunt Claire's illness proved remarkably stubborn, they built a world that existed strictly between the hours of 2 and 5. James picked her up in a black carriage with the curtains drawn. It was a scandal on wheels, and Elodie found she had a taste for it. But even inside their bubble, reality had a habit of intruding. One rainy Tuesday, as the carriage sat parked by the Seine, Elodie watched James closely. He was shuffling a deck of cards, teaching her piquet, but his hands were shaking, just slightly. "You disappear," she said quietly, "on Wednesday mornings and Friday afternoons. You are never where you say you will be." James froze. He didn't look up from the cards. "I have correspondence. Boring estate matters." "You are a terrible liar, James," Elodie said, leaning forward. "You are on a tour. You are supposed to be idle, dissolute, and perhaps a little drunk, but you have the eyes of a man who is looking over his shoulder." "Are you a spy?" James laughed, but it sounded forced. "A spy? Rose, I assure you, I am not that interesting." "Then do not lie to me," she whispered. "I can bear anything but the lying." James looked at her then. He dropped the cards. He took her face in his hands, his thumbs tracing her cheekbones with a reverence that made her breath hitch. "I am not a spy," he said fiercely. "I am just a man who is trapped in a life he did not choose. But when I am with you, I am just a man." It was the closest he ever came to the truth. By the 8th week, the leaves had turned brown, and the flirtation had turned into something desperate. They stood at the gate of his villa, the air biting with frost. Elodie was humming La Claire Fontaine. James hummed the harmony, his chest vibrating against her shoulder. They fit together. It was that simple and that terrifying. "Bonjour, mes tourtereaux." Madame Lefebvre popped up over the wall. She had been watching them for 2 months. She had seen the carriage. She had seen the way James shielded Elodie from the wind. She had seen the way they looked at each other when they thought the world wasn't watching. "Madame," James nodded. "The frost is coming early," the old woman noted, glancing at the sky. She looked at Elodie. "You look peaceful today, child. Being a wife suits you." Elodie froze. "Wife?" She opened her mouth to correct the assumption. "To say I'm a lady, I am betrothed to a duke, and this is entirely improper." But she looked up at James. He wasn't correcting her. He was watching Elodie, waiting. He didn't look like he wanted to fix the mistake. He looked like a man who would trade his entire fortune to make it true. "It does, doesn't it?" James said softly to the neighbor. Madame Lefebvre winked, a gesture that contained volumes of unsaid knowledge, and disappeared. Elodie turned to James, her heart hammering against her ribs. "James, we are letting them believe a lie." "Is it a lie?" James whispered, framing her face with his gloved hands. "In here, in this lane. Who are we, Rose? For 8 weeks, you have been mine. Yours," she promised recklessly. "Always." "Tomorrow?" he asked, his thumb brushing her lip. "Tomorrow," she vowed, "I will bring you a tart, blackberry and apple, to celebrate us." She pulled away, running back to the corner where the carriage waited. She felt light. She felt infinite. Aunt Claire was still sick. The parents were still gone. She had time. She didn't know that the blue carriage of the Count de Valois had rolled through the city gates an hour ago. She didn't know that tomorrow would never come. The letter arrived at the villa at midnight, delivered by a courier whose mud-spattered boots offended Sebastian's sensibilities almost as much as the news he carried. It was not a request. It was a summons from the crown. In the study, Sebastian tossed the heavy parchment onto the desk. The wax seal cracked against the wood, a sound like a pistol shot in the quiet room. "It is done, James." Sebastian's voice was calm, the voice of a man who had been expecting this disaster for 8 weeks. "The king demands your presence. The estate demands its duke. We leave tonight." James stood by the window, staring out at the dark lane where he had kissed Elodie's hand only hours ago. The glass was cold against his forehead, grounding him. "I cannot just leave," James whispered, the words scraping his throat. "I have to tell her." "Tell her what?" Sebastian challenged, pouring himself a brandy he didn't intend to drink. "That you are the Duke of Aylesford, that you have been lying to her since the moment you met. Look at the facts. If you go to her now, at midnight, you ruin her reputation. If you say goodbye, she will cry. And if she cries, you will stay." James gripped the window ledge until his knuckles turned white. "She deserves a goodbye, Sebastian. She is not just a diversion. Then give her the greatest mercy you can," Sebastian said ruthlessly. "Let her hate you. Let her believe you are just a coward who got bored. It will make it easier for her to accept the stranger she's bound to marry." James closed his eyes. The logic was cruel, impeccable, and utterly heartless. It was exactly the sort of thing a duke would do. "Pack the trunks," James said, his voice hollow. "We leave within the hour." The next morning, the sun shone on the Paris with a brilliance that felt like a personal insult. Elodie was humming. She stood in the Valois kitchen, dusting sugar over the crust of a blackberry tart. It was warm, heavy, and smelled of sweet apples and victory. The house was blissfully silent. Her parents were still in Lyon, nursing Aunt Claire's eternal convalescence. Elodie was the mistress of the house and the mistress of her own heart. "Mademoiselle, you are making a mess." The cook smiled, wiping her hands on her apron. "It is a beautiful mess, Marie." Elodie beamed. She wrapped the tart in a linen cloth, placed it in a basket, and slipped out the garden gate. She didn't walk. The villa was too far, hidden away on the left bank. She hurried to the boulevard and hailed a passing hackney coach. A public extravagance she would have to explain later, but she didn't care. "To the Rue de Varennes," she instructed the driver, clutching the basket on her lap. The ride took 20 minutes. 20 minutes of watching the Seine glitter through the window, 20 minutes of rehearsing her smile. When the coach finally rattled to a halt at the corner of the ivy-walled lane, she paid the driver with trembling hands and stepped out. She walked the final stretch to the lane. She imagined James's face when he saw the pastry. He would make a dry comment about English food being superior simply to annoy her. She would laugh. They would hold hands through the bars, and for 20 minutes the looming threat of England would vanish. She turned the corner. The lane was silent. That was the first thing she noticed. Usually, the air around the villa hummed with his energy. Today, the air felt flat, stale. She walked to the iron gate. It was locked. "James?" she whispered. She rattled the handle. The metal clanged against metal, a lonely, hollow sound. Nothing. The curtains of the villa were drawn tight. The windows were dark eyes staring back at her. There was no smoke from the chimney. The potted geraniums by the door had been moved. A cold dread began to pool in her stomach, heavy and sick. She knocked on the gate, harder this time. "James!" "It is Rose." The front door of the villa didn't open. Instead, a side door creaked. A French caretaker she had never seen before stepped out, sweeping the steps with a broom. He looked at her with the weary indifference of a man who had seen too many weeping women. "Monsieur?" Elodie called out, her voice trembling. "The Englishman. Monsieur James?" The caretaker didn't look up. He kept sweeping, the sound of the bristles against the stone grating on her nerves. "Gone, mademoiselle." Elodie's hands tightened on the basket until the wicker bit into her skin. "Gone to the market. Gone to England." The man grunted. "Left in the middle of the night. Cleared out everything. Even the linens." The basket slipped from Elodie's fingers. It hit the cobblestones with a wet thud. The linen parted. The tart, with its perfect sugar crust, lay smashed in the dirt, the blackberry juice bleeding out like dark blood. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. He said tomorrow. He promised." "They always say tomorrow." A gentle voice said. Elodie turned. Madame Lefebvre was standing on her side of the low stone wall. She wasn't holding her shears today. She was holding a handkerchief. She looked at the smashed tart and then at Elodie's face. Her eyes filled with an infinite, weary sadness. "Come, child," the old woman said softly, opening her own garden gate. "Do not stand in the street for a ghost." Elodie didn't move. She couldn't. Her legs felt like lead. He didn't say goodbye. "I know." Madame Lefebvre sighed. She stepped out into the lane, ignoring the mud on her slippers, and wrapped a thin arm around Elodie's waist. Men think silence is kindness. They do not realize it is a knife that never stops cutting. She led Elodie into her garden, away from the locked villa. She sat her down on a stone bench and held her freezing hands. "He loved you," Madame Lefebvre said firmly. "I saw his face yesterday, child. That man loved you." "Then why?" Elodie choked out, the first sob breaking loose, tearing through her chest. "Why did he leave me?" "Because he is a man, my dear," the old woman whispered, smoothing Elodie's hair, and men are often terrified of the very thing they want most. For an hour, Elodie cried in the arms of a stranger. She cried for the tart. She cried for the jokes. She cried for the lie that she had allowed herself to believe. When she finally walked home, empty-handed, she left the smashed tart in the lane. The birds were already pecking at the crust. 2 weeks passed, 2 weeks of grey skies and endless silence. Elodie didn't hum anymore. She didn't sneak out. She sat in the window of her bedroom, watching the street, waiting for a blue carriage she knew would eventually come. At first, she felt only the burn of betrayal, but slowly, in the quiet dark of the empty house, a colder, sharper comfort took root. She had lied too, hadn't she? She had never told him she was a Valois. She had never told him she was promised to a duke. She had let him believe she was free when she was just as bound by duty as he was. Perhaps this was justice. 2 liars, parting in silence. It was better this way. James was a dream, and dreams do not survive the waking world. Now she could stop pretending. She could focus on reality, on England, on the duty she had been born to fulfill. On the 14th day, the peace ended. The front doors opened. Her father didn't even remove his travel coat before he knocked on her door. He entered, looking brisk and efficient. He didn't notice that his daughter looked like she was recovering from a fever. He didn't notice the shadows under her eyes. He only saw an asset ready for transfer. "Elodie," the Count said, pulling on his gloves. "The trunks are packed." Elodie looked up slowly from the window seat. Her eyes were dry. "The ship is ready," he said. "We leave for England tomorrow." He paused, looking at her lack of reaction. He mistook her numbness for obedience. "Cheer up, girl," he said, turning to leave. "You're going to be a duchess. You will have a husband to take care of you." Elodie turned back to the window, looking at the empty street where no black carriage waited. "I have no husband," she whispered to the cold glass. "And I have no heart left to give him." Aylesford Castle was not a home. It was a fortress built to withstand sieges, time, and happiness. It sat on the edge of a cliff, grey stone against a grey sky, battered by a wind that seemed to have a personal vendetta against warmth. James stood in the library, staring into the roaring fire. He had been back for 2 weeks. In those 2 weeks, he had successfully murdered James, the man who liked riddles and blackberry tarts. Only the Duke remained. The Duke was efficient. The Duke was cold. The Duke did not hum. "You look like you're waiting for a firing squad, Your Grace." James didn't turn. Sebastian was lounging on a velvet sofa, tossing a walnut into the air and catching it. "I'm waiting for a wife, Sebastian. A firing squad would be quicker and significantly less talkative. Come now." Sebastian cracked the walnut. "She's a French count's daughter, Lady Elodie. She will likely be charming, petite, and obsessed with silk. You might even like her." James snapped, turning from the fire. His face was a mask of hard lines. "I do not want to like her. I want to marry her, secure the alliance, produce an heir, and then live separate lives in separate wings of this mausoleum. That is the agreement." Sebastian stopped chewing. He looked at his friend with genuine pity. You are punishing her for a crime she didn't commit, James. It is not her fault that you left your heart in a Parisian alleyway. It is not Lady Elodie's fault that she isn't Rose. James stiffened. The name hit him like a physical blow. Rose, the girl who refused to tell him her last name, the girl who smelled of rain and cheap wine. Do not speak her name. His voice was low. Dangerous. Rose was a hallucination. This is reality. 2 days earlier, the reality was just as cold in London. The carriage rattled over the cobblestones, shaking Elodie to her very bones. England was grey. It tasted like soot and regret. She pulled her cloak tighter, but the chill wasn't in the air. It was in her blood. Stop trembling, child. Aunt Agatha patted her knee with a gloved hand. Her aunt had lived in London for 20 years and had the stiff spine to prove it. You're not going to the gallows. You're going to a townhouse in Mayfair, and on Saturday you will be a duchess. Elodie looked out the window at the blurring brick walls. I feel like a sheep, she whispered, being led to the butcher. Nonsense. Agatha adjusted her hat. The Duke of Aylesford is one of the most powerful men in England. He's wealthy, he is titled, and he needs a wife. You need security. It is a perfect arrangement. Security. That was the word her father had used when he sold her. He hadn't called it a sale, of course. He called it an alliance. But Elodie knew the truth. Her father's debts were high, and her value was higher. The carriage lurched to a halt in front of a looming townhouse. Servants were already rushing down the steps with umbrellas. Elodie didn't move. She closed her eyes and let herself have one dangerous, forbidden thought. James. She saw his smile, the way his hair fell over his forehead in that crooked tavern in Paris. She had lied to him. She had told him her name was Rose. She had told him she was a nobody, just like him, and for 2 weeks she had been Rose. She had been free. But James was gone. He had vanished into the Paris fog, leaving Rose behind, and now Elodie had to pay for Rose's sins. Elodie, her aunt's voice was sharp. The Duke's footmen are waiting. Elodie opened her eyes. She pushed James and Rose back into the dark corner of her heart and locked the door. She lifted her chin. I'm ready, Aunt Agatha. She stepped out into the cold English rain. She was ready to play her part. She would be the perfect frozen doll the Duke had paid for. The laces tightened. Elodie gasped, gripping the bedpost. The maid pulled again. Harder. Forgive me, my lady, the maid whispered. But the gown, it is heavy. It was. It was a masterpiece of white silk and crushed pearls. It didn't feel like a wedding dress. It felt like a receipt. Elodie looked in the mirror. The woman staring back was beautiful and dead. She touched the cold glass. James. The name was a prayer she wasn't allowed to speak. She closed her eyes and saw him, the way he leaned against the damp brick wall in the alleyway. He was poor. He was nobody, and he was the only freedom she had ever known. Elodie. Her father's voice cracked the memory like a mirror. The Count stood in the doorway. He looked proud, not proud of her, proud of what she had achieved for him. The carriage is waiting, he said. Do not look so tragic. You are saving your family name. The ride to St. Jude's Cathedral was a blur of grey rain. Elodie stared at the floor of the carriage. She counted the scuffs on her father's boots. She would not look at the city. She would not look at the sky. If she looked up, she might cry. And the Count had forbidden tears. When the carriage stopped, the door opened to a wall of grey stone. The cathedral was a monster. Her father stepped out first. He offered his hand. His grip was tight, too tight. It wasn't a comforting hold. It was a shackle. Chin up, he hissed as they climbed the stone steps. But keep your eyes modest. The whole of England is watching. Inside, the air was thick with incense and expectation. The organ groaned, a low, vibrating chord that rattled her ribs. The doors opened. 300 heads turned. The silence was deafening. Elodie did not look at the crowd. She looked at the red carpet. It stretched out forever, a long, bloody line leading to her doom. At the end of the world, he stood, the Duke of Aylesford. She didn't look at him. She saw only the hem of a black coat and polished black boots. She fixed her eyes on the toes of her own silk slippers. 1 step, thump. Her heart hit her ribs. 2 steps, thump. Her father pulled her forward. He was eager. He was walking too fast. He was rushing to hand over the deed. She kept her head bowed. Please be kind, she thought. Please just be kind. She didn't want love. She had left love in Paris. She just wanted mercy. James stared at the gold cross on the altar. He was not in the cathedral. He was in a small room in Montmartre, listening to the rain hit the roof. He was thinking of Rose. He was thinking of the way she laughed when he tried to speak French. She had loved him. Not the Duke, just him, and he had left her. He clenched his jaw. He could hear the bride approaching. He didn't want to look. He didn't want to see the French aristocrat who had been purchased to breed his heirs. He hated her. He hated her because she wasn't Rose. They reached the altar. Her father stopped. He took Elodie's hand from his arm. She didn't lift her head. She stared at the stone floor. "Your Grace," her father said. A tone of oily reverence. "I present my daughter." James sighed. A short, sharp sound of impatience. He turned. He didn't look at her face. He looked at her father. He took the hand her father offered. His grip was cold, impersonal. He pulled her to his side, claiming his property. Her father stepped back, satisfied. The transaction was complete. Elodie squeezed her eyes shut beneath the veil. She felt the size of him beside her, a wall of heat and ice. "Dearly beloved," the bishop's voice boomed. James stared straight ahead. But then the wind changed. The draft from the door caught her veil, and the scent hit him. It cut through the incense. It cut through the stale air of the church, blackberries, and rain. James froze. His heart hammered a frantic rhythm against his sternum. No, it wasn't possible. He looked down. He saw the top of her bowed head. He saw the hands clutching the bouquet. He knew those hands. He had kissed those knuckles. He saw the curve of her neck. He reached out. His hand trembled. The crowd gasped. He grabbed the edge of her veil. Elodie stopped breathing. She felt his hand. It was warm. She kept her head down, waiting for the strike, waiting for the judgment. James ripped the veil back. "Look at me," he commanded, a whisper that sounded like a shout. Elodie's head snapped up. She looked into the cold, hard face of the Duke and saw light blue eyes, impeccable auburn hair with a deep side part, a sharp, clean-shaven jaw. "James." Her lips parted. A silent scream. "You," she whispered. The color drained from James's face. He looked like he had been shot. He stared at her, at the woman he had mourned, the woman he had murdered his own happiness for. She wasn't a memory. She was standing here in a dress worth a fortune, marrying the Duke of Aylesford. She wasn't Rose, the anonymous girl of Paris. She was Lady Elodie. The betrayal hit him first. Then the relief. Then the rage. James's eyes darkened, shifting from the man she had loved to the stranger she now feared. He leaned in, close, intimate. The congregation thought he was whispering a vow. Her father watched from the front row, beaming, mistaking it for affection. "Hello, Rose," James snarled, his voice a shard of glass. Elodie flinched. Her tear slipped out, hot and fast, tracking through the powder on her cheek. She wasn't marrying a stranger. She was marrying the man who broke her heart, and he looked like he wanted to break it all over again. "Hello, Rose." The name hung in the air, invisible to the 300 guests, but heavy enough to crush Elodie's lungs. She stared at him. The shock was turning into something sharper. "You," she whispered. Her voice trembled, but her eyes hardened. "You let me believe you were just passing through, that you were no one who mattered to the world." James's grip on her veil tightened. His eyes were blue ice. "And you," he hissed, leaning in so close only she could hear, "you let me believe you were free. I thought Rose had vanished into Paris. No name, no trace. nothing I could follow. Rose is gone, Elodie said softly. You made sure of that when you left without a word. Her gaze dropped to his hand. The ducal ring, the crest she now recognized. And you let me believe you were only James, she continued. Not this. She glanced at the cathedral, the gold, the weight, the watching world. You lied to me every time you held my hand. The sound was loud, deliberate. The bishop cleared his throat, irritation plain on his face. Your Grace, he said sharply. We are waiting. God is waiting. James pulled back. The intimacy shattered. Cold air rushed between them. He straightened. The Duke returned. Apologies, James said. He did not sound repentant. He sounded controlled. Please, continue. Elodie lowered her head, but she could feel his gaze, burning, unrelenting. The bishop resumed. If any man can show just cause. James looked at her. He knew 1,000 causes. She was a liar. She was a stranger. She was the woman who had undone him. And she was beautiful. The aisle was a mile long. James gripped her hand. His skin burned against hers. To the crowd, it looked like a duke supporting his blushing bride. To Elodie, it felt like being escorted under guard. Wave, James murmured through his teeth, nodding toward a duchess in the second pew. Elodie lifted her hand. It felt like lead. I hate you, she whispered without moving her lips, her smile fixed in porcelain. I hate you for making me love you. James didn't look at her. His eyes stayed on the heavy oak doors at the far end of the church. Save your breath, Rose, he replied quietly. We have a lifetime for hatred. They stepped out into the grey English afternoon. A cheer rose from the gathered crowd. White rose petals fell around them like snow. It was beautiful. It was a lie. A footman opened the carriage door. The Aylesford crest gleamed in gold on the side. Rampant lion, all teeth and dominance. James helped her inside with careful precision, as if she were something fragile and expensive. He climbed in after her. The door slammed shut. The lock clicked. The world disappeared. The carriage lurched forward. James turned on her immediately. The mask shattered. You are a fraud, he said quietly. His voice was worse for its restraint. Lady Elodie Valois, a count's daughter, and I worried about you. A sharp, humorless laugh tore out of him. I spent nights awake wondering if Rose had vanished forever, if she was safe, if she would ever forgive me for leaving. His blue eyes burned into hers. But you weren't lost, were you? You weren't unreachable. You were promised, protected, watched, and you let me believe you were free. Elodie's fear snapped. She shoved his chest hard. Free, she laughed bitterly. You sat across from me in that tavern and let me believe you were only passing through. You drank sour wine and laughed like nothing waited for you beyond Paris. You let me think we were equals, two people with nothing to lose. Her voice shook, but she didn't stop. You let me trust you. James recoiled as if struck. I was escaping, he snapped. I wanted 1 week where I wasn't a title. 1 week where a woman looked at me and saw a man. And you found her, Elodie shot back. And then you vanished. Her strength drained. She fell back against the velvet seat, suddenly exhausted. We are both liars, she said hoarsely. You lied by omission. I lied by silence. You cheated me out of the only man I ever loved. She swallowed. And I cheated you out of the woman you thought you knew. Silence swallowed the carriage. James stared at her. His chest rose and fell. For one terrible second, he looked like the man from Paris. Unguarded, shaken, human. Then his gaze dropped to the diamonds at her throat. The walls slammed back into place. It does not matter, James said coldly, straightening his coat. Rose is gone. James is gone. He turned toward the window. We are strangers, Elodie. When we arrive at Aylesford, you will reside in the East Wing. I will remain in the West. We will speak only when necessary. He looked at her then. Empty. Controlled. Do not expect a husband. You married a title. Be content with that. Elodie turned to her own window, pressing her palm to the cold glass. "Fine," she whispered to the rain. "I never wanted a title." Her reflection stared back at her, composed, wounded, unbroken. "I wanted the man who no longer exists." The carriage wheels crunched on gravel. Elodie looked up. Aylesford Castle rose out of the mist like a judgment. Grey stone, narrow windows, a place built to endure war, weather, and inconvenient emotion. A fortress. The footman opened the carriage door. James stepped out first. He didn't stalk away. He turned back and extended a gloved hand to her. "Careful," he said quietly. "The steps are slick with rain." Elodie took his hand. His grip was firm, steady, protective. It struck her then, how cruelly skilled he was at this, how easily he could care for her body while barring her from everything else. She stepped down onto the gravel and searched his face for a crack in the armor, for anger, for heat, for anything human. There was nothing. James had sealed himself shut. "Welcome home, Your Grace," the butler intoned. James inclined his head. "Peters, have the staff bring Her Grace's trunks to the master suite." He turned to Elodie, voice polished and distant. "You will be tired. I've instructed the kitchen to prepare a light supper for you. You may wish to rest after the exertions of the day." A dismissal, perfectly mannered, perfectly cruel. Elodie felt the sting and refused it. "I'm not tired, James." His gaze flicked to her, sharp. "And I do not wish to dine alone in my room like a prisoner." She removed her gloves deliberately and reminded herself she was not a guest here. She handed her cloak to a waiting footman. "I will dine with you." A muscle jumped in James's jaw. "I have correspondence," he said coolly. "Estate matters that were neglected during my absence." "Then I will sit in the library and read while you work," she replied. She stepped closer, lowering her voice. "You can hide behind the title if you wish, but do not insult me by pretending I frighten you." His eyes darkened. "You mistake me," he said. "I'm trying to spare you." She smiled, sharp, knowing. "No," she said. "You're trying to spare yourself." Silence stretched. Then James gestured toward the doors. "After you, wife." The library was vast and warm, lined with shelves that climbed toward the ceiling. Firelight flickered over leather spines and polished wood. James went straight to the desk. He sat, picked up a pen. Elodie watched him for a moment. The rigid posture, the white-knuckled grip. He wasn't working. He was hiding. She crossed to the sofa near the fire and sat. "You know," she said lightly, "in Paris, you told me you hated silence." His pen paused. "In Paris," he said without looking up, "I was careless." "No," Elodie replied. "In Paris, you were honest." He finally looked at her. "Why are you so afraid of happiness, James?" she asked quietly. "Is the title so heavy it crushed the man I knew?" He set the pen down. "The man you knew," he said, voice controlled, "was not real." "He is sitting 10 feet from me," she said. She rose and approached the desk, placing her hands on the polished wood. "I forgive you." The words landed like a blow. She continued gently. "I forgive the lie, because I lied too. We both wanted to be someone else." She covered his hand with hers. "But we are done pretending." James inhaled slowly. "You do not understand what you are asking," he said. "If I let you close, I will not be gentle." Elodie met his gaze without flinching. "I'm not afraid of you." That was the moment. Not when he touched her. Not when he leaned in. The moment he realized she was not going to leave. James stood abruptly, stepping away from the desk. "This does not change anything," he said. "You will sleep in the East Wing tonight." Elodie's heart stuttered, but she nodded. "Very well." He turned toward the door. "And James?" He paused. "You may lock yourself away if you wish," she said softly. "But do not pretend this house is quiet." She brushed past him, her skirts whispering against the stone floor. "Because I am here now." James stood alone in the library, staring at the door long after it closed. For the first time since Paris, the silence did not obey him. James didn't just kiss her. He breathed her in, whiskey and rain and the kind of longing that had nowhere left to go. His hands slid into her hair, messy and desperate, as if he'd been holding himself together with sheer will, and she'd just undone the knot. Elodie clung to his coat and pulled him closer, trying to erase the air between them. There was no Duke here. No, Your Grace. There was only James, shaking like a man, standing too close to the edge of something he'd wanted for far too long. He pulled back, his hand cradling her jaw with a gentleness that somehow felt more dangerous than force. He didn't close his eyes. He looked straight into hers, pupils blown wide as if he needed to see the choice in her face. "I'm not good at restraint with you," he said, voice rough, almost helpless. "I should send you to the East Wing. I should do what is proper." His thumb brushed her bottom lip, slow, like he was memorizing the shape of her. "And yet," he breathed, "I can't." Elodie swallowed. His eyes, those once cold eyes, were all blue fire now. "I do not want proper," she whispered. "I want you." Something in him broke. Quietly, completely. He made a sound low in his throat. Not triumph, not arrogance. Defeat. Devotion. And without another word, he swept her into his arms. Elodie gasped, looping her arms around his neck as he carried her out of the library, past the watchful portraits and the heavy silence of generations, up the grand staircase, through the dark hallways that suddenly felt too small for what was happening between them. He kicked open the door to the master suite. The room was dim, lit only by the dying embers in the fireplace, warm gold against shadow. The great four-poster stood like a throne in the center of it all, but James didn't look like a king as he set her down on the edge of the mattress. He looked like a man who'd been starving. He reached for her hands and found her gloves. Slowly, carefully, he unbuttoned them as if each small motion was a vow. He peeled the silk from her skin, turning her palm upward to press a kiss to the fragile pulse in her wrist. "You're warm," he murmured there, as if the words pained him with sweetness. "I've been cold for so long." Elodie's breath shook. "James." He lifted his head, searching her face like he needed permission written into her expression, not merely spoken. "Tell me to stop," he said softly. Commanding but not controlling, anchored. "Tell me to send you away and I will. I swear it." He waited. He gave her the power like it belonged to her, which it did. Elodie lifted her hand and traced the sharp line of his jaw, her thumb lingering against his cheek. "If you leave," she whispered, "I will chase you." James closed his eyes. A shudder ran through him like a prayer answered. He stood, and the way he removed his coat, his cravat, was unhurried, deliberate, as though he was making room for something sacred. Firelight moved over him, turning him into flicker and warmth and humanity. Not untouchable, not distant, just real. He climbed onto the bed beside her and reached up to her hair, drawing out each pin with tender patience until dark waves spilled over her shoulders. His fingers threaded through it as if he couldn't believe he was allowed. "My wife," he whispered. Not a claim, a reverent confession. "My Rose." Elodie's chest tightened, and when he kissed her again, it wasn't desperate anymore. It was deep, slow, certain, a promise made without words. His hand slid to her cheek, then to her shoulder, as if he was learning the shape of comfort after years of emptiness. He tucked her closer, kept his mouth at her temple, her jaw, the soft place beneath her hair, kissing her like he had time, like nothing in the world could drag him away. Outside, the rain kept falling. The house kept breathing around them. And somewhere between the hush of the fire and the heat of his hands, Elodie stopped remembering everything that had tried to tear them apart. Debts, lies, pride, fear, because James held her like none of it mattered. Like she mattered more. When the last of his restraint finally gave way, it wasn't with haste or hunger that frightened. It was with tenderness that overwhelmed. And when he buried his face against her neck, the sound he made was not a victory. It was relief. It was a man coming home. The sun did not shine in Kent. It merely seeped through the clouds. A pale, diluted light crept across the velvet rug and climbed the side of the bed. James was already awake. He lay propped on one elbow, watching Elodie sleep. In repose, she looked younger, unarmed. Her lashes rested dark against her cheeks, her mouth softened by dreams. For a dangerous moment, she looked exactly as she had in Paris, and that frightened him more than anything else. He had not worn a costume then. He had not been pretending to be poor or foolish or free. He had simply been James. And for a few stolen weeks, that had been enough. Elodie stirred. Her eyes opened slowly, unfocused at first, then settling on him. She did not startle. She did not look for the Duke. She looked for the man. "You're still here," she whispered, her voice rough with sleep. "I have nowhere else to be," James replied quietly. His thumb traced the line of her jaw before he could stop himself. He had spent 2 weeks in this castle, convinced she had been a mirage, something conjured by exhaustion and longing. "I thought I imagined you," he admitted. "The girl in the alley. I thought desperation had invented you." Elodie shifted closer, the sheet whispering. "I wasn't imagined," she said, "but I was hidden. I had to be." His mouth tightened. "I didn't lie to you," James said slowly. "I simply didn't tell you everything. I thought it didn't matter. I thought we were two people passing through a city that asked nothing of us." He met her eyes. "I didn't realize I was escaping my life while you were being driven into yours." Elodie pushed herself up, resting on one arm. Her gaze drifted past him, to the carved bedposts, the heavy drapes, the grandeur that still felt foreign, and then returned. "James." "Yes, if it hadn't been me." His body stilled. "If you had lifted the veil," she said carefully, "and it was another woman, would you have married her?" He did not hesitate. "Yes." The word landed between them. Elodie's breath caught, "Even knowing what you felt." "Yes," he repeated, "and I would have hated myself for it." He looked away, jaw set. "I was raised on duty, on finishing what you begin. And by the time I stood at that altar, it wasn't only my life at stake." His voice lowered. "If I broke it publicly, she would have carried the damage." "Her," Elodie echoed softly. He nodded once. "She would have deserved kindness," he said. "She would have deserved respect. She would have deserved safety." Silence stretched. "And you?" Elodie asked. James turned back to her. "I would have lived correctly," he said. "I would have kept my vows." A pause. "And I would have been living a lie." Elodie blinked hard. "Paris didn't pass through me," James went on. "It stayed. I tried to look at other women and couldn't. Not honestly." "Because of me," she whispered. "Yes." His voice was steady. "Because I would have seen your face everywhere. Because I would have stood beside her and felt the wrongness in my bones." He took Elodie's hand, holding it firmly. "And I would have wondered," he said quietly, "whether you hated me for leaving, whether you believed I used you, whether you thought I returned to my life untouched." Her eyes burned. "Did you forget me?" "No." The word was absolute. He lifted her hand and pressed a kiss to her knuckles. "I do not want a single day of my life," he said, "where you doubt my love for you." Elodie held his gaze, her breath unsteady. "And then," James said softly, "I lifted the veil." He stopped, as if even memory required permission. "And it was you." The silence that followed was not peaceful. It was heavy with everything still unsaid. Morning had settled fully by the time the house grew quiet again. Sunlight slipped through the tall windows of the breakfast room, pale but determined, warming the long table and the silver laid out with practiced ease. Outside, a carriage rolled down the drive and vanished into the mist. James stood by the window, hands clasped behind his back, watching it go. He waited for satisfaction, found only relief. "He's gone," he said. "Yes," Elodie replied. She stood near the table, one hand resting lightly on the polished wood as if grounding herself. She wore a soft morning gown, her hair loosely pinned. There was an ease to her now, tentative, but real. "I thought I would feel angry," she admitted, "or triumphant. And instead," she smiled, surprised by her own answer, "I feel light." James crossed the room without thinking about propriety. He stopped close enough to feel her warmth. He took her hand and pressed his lips to the simple gold band. "Not ceremony, truth. I once told you I wanted something real," he said quietly. "I thought I meant a person." Elodie tilted her head. "And now? I meant a life." She inhaled, then hesitated. "James," she said, and there was something careful in her voice now. "There is something I should have told you sooner about our parents, about why my father was so certain this match." The door opened. "Well," came a composed voice, "this is unexpected." James straightened. "Mother." The Dowager Duchess of Aylesford entered with the calm assurance of a woman who had never doubted her right to any room. Her gaze moved from her son to Elodie, and then lingering, curiously, as though she were seeing something she hadn't anticipated. Then she smiled. "Well," she said again, "that explains a great deal." Elodie blinked. "Does it?" "My dear," the Duchess said lightly, "when I married James's father, it took months before we managed to sit in the same room without bracing ourselves. And yet here you are, morning after your wedding, standing together as though you've known each other for years." James frowned. "Mother," she waved him silent. "I would have expected stiffness, awkwardness, at the very least visible effort." Elodie smiled politely. "We've had a great deal to discuss." "So I see." The Duchess turned to James. "Which makes this a sensible moment to mention something you appear not to know." James's brow furrowed. "What is that?" The Duchess folded her hands. "Your wife's father and I were once romantically involved." Silence. James stared. "You and the Count de Valois?" "Yes," she said calmly. "Long before marriage. Before titles. Before we learned to be sensible." He turned slowly to Elodie. "You knew?" "Of course," Elodie said. "Papa never concealed it. Nor did my mother pretend not to notice." "And you didn't tell me?" James asked. Elodie met his gaze evenly. "I was seconds away from telling you," she said. "Your mother simply arrived first." The Duchess smiled, unapologetic. "When the Count wrote to me," she said, "it was not strategy, James. It was trust, and perhaps a little nostalgia. He believed, rightly or wrongly, that our children might manage better than we did." James let out a breath. "So that is why he was so certain." "Certainty," his mother said, "is often memory wearing confidence." Elodie laughed softly. James shook his head. "I was prepared to dislike a stranger. And instead," Elodie said gently, "you married someone who didn't feel like one." The Duchess rose. "That is all I wish to tell you." She moved toward the door, then paused. "For what it's worth, it took me years to feel at ease as a duchess." Elodie inclined her head. "It helps not to feel alone." The Duchess smiled at that. Indeed. When she left, the room felt warmer. James turned to Elodie, a slow, incredulous smile forming. "So you knew all along?" "Yes," she said. "I simply didn't realize you didn't." He laughed quietly and drew her into his arms. "It seems," he murmured, "that we were both missing pieces." Elodie rested her forehead against his chest. "And still found each other," she said. James kissed her hair. This time, there was nowhere else to be.
I loved you like a borrowed secret, like something I was meant to lose. I never asked the name you carry, never thought the truth was you. I watched
watched you with a careful distance, afraid of what my heart confessed. I never knew the love I found was the one I was meant to protect.
If only I knew who you were. If only you knew we loved in the dark of fate's silence, blind to what we couldn't see.
They spoke of duty like a blessing, like love was something learned in time.
I didn't know my heart had chosen what was already mine.
I thought the cost was loving you.
I never counted what I'd lose. I didn't know the life I feared was the one I was walking to. If only I knew who you were. If only you knew we loved in the dark of fate's silence, blind to what we couldn't see. Stayed a moment longer, held your name inside my breath. But I believed our love was ending, not beginning with regret.
I would have spoken without fear if I had known the truth was written.
In the moment I met you, we were standing at the threshold of a life we couldn't claim,
Loving blind, loving faithful,
to a truth without a name. Now I carry what was never spoken in the quiet of my days. Loving you in recollection is the price I will always pay.
I live the life they chose for me.
With honor stitched into my name, but every breath is marked by knowing I loved you just the same. If only I knew who you were. If only you knew we loved before the truth could reach us, before fate set us free. I live the life they chose for me, with honor stitched into my name. But every breath is marked by knowing I loved you just the same. If only I knew who you were. If only you knew we loved before the truth could reach us, before fate set us free. If only I knew. If only you